I'm talking about AngularJS, and this is introduction and its basics. So if you have done something with Angular, I'm looking at you, Julio, you probably shouldn't be here because this is very, very basics, and you will just learn to use Angular if you haven't used it before. Just a quick disclaimer, because that's quite popular right now to do that, but I do it a little bit different. I don't like JavaScript. That's hopefully you don't like it as well, because that's the default. And this talk is not about JavaScript itself, it's about Angular, but about AngularJS, not Angular Dart or anything other fancy. It's about Angular 1. something, not about 2 point something. And you might have heard that there will be some changes in 2.0, but I'm not talking much about that. I'm also not talking about CoffeeScript or TypeScript, which is commonly used to create JavaScript afterwards, but yeah, you might use it, but I don't. And it's for beginners, I've already stated, and this is my opinion. Let's begin. Let's begin with something you might have seen a couple of years ago or still have seen today. This is Jquery and not JavaScript, with not vanilla JavaScript, and it's not Angular. This is Jquery. You're familiar with that, and you should maybe see what it does. It actually is a Hello World data binding example with Jquery. We have on top the script tag which gives us Jquery. We have an input tag, we have an h1 headline tag, and we bind data from the input fields to an h1 field. That's what we do at the bottom, which means every time we have a key pressed, we do that. That's Jquery, and I call that the dark ages, because at some point you end up with something like that. And that's, you don't have to read it. It's actually my code I have written a couple of years ago, and I don't want to talk about that. But let's go back to the data binding in Jquery. That sounds quite weird, because you have on top something that is maybe called a view, and at the bottom you have something that is maybe called a controller, something in an MVC world. But somehow you in the controller have to bind the view, so that sounds a little bit weird, right? So there must be a better option. Actually there is. This is the same example with Angular. There is no controller. There is no code that does some logic. It's just a data binding example which has an input field, and it has something which is called ngModel. That's a directive. We'll talk about that later. And it binds that model to a data binding expression, which is at the bottom. You see the name tag there. So this should do the same as the Jquery example. Let's have a look. Okay, before we have a look, maybe I tell you that I'm doing live coding, which is weird, and that usually fails, but I still do it. Can you see the code on the left side? Yes, you can. Maybe we can have it a little bit bigger. And what you see here is I have an input field, and if I type my, well, let's type consisto, you see nothing happens, because we haven't done anything so far. And the single most failure you do is you include your Angular script, and then you do that expression we just saw, but you forget something which is called this one. This is the ng app, and you have to tell your HTML or your DOM actually that it is an Angular application, and this has to be annotated at the top with ng app or somewhere where you require it. You could do it on your body tag as well if you want. And then we have an input tag here, as you have seen, and we create something that I already told you that this is this is a directive, which is called ngModel, and this is a built-in directive. Angular has a couple of them, and we will use just built-in directives, but you can write your own, which means you can write your own stuff that binds something to a specific element in HTML. And we give that model a name, and in that case we call it name. And when we have a headline and we want to do the same thing that we just saw, you want to output that. Which means if we refresh that and type consisto, that means the first live coding example has worked. And that means you have seen everything from Angular. Is there any question? Because now you should go outside and build something with that, because that's already quite cool. And as you saw, I haven't written any single line of JavaScript code, which is the best part, right? No JavaScript at all. Let's go back to the slides quick, and I'm telling you what I else will do in live coding, which usually fails. You just saw the data binding example. We do something about directives a little bit. I'm going to show you what modules are and how they are used. Something about controllers, which is a core concept in AngularJS, and services, factories, and providers, which is also quite interesting. And if we have time, we do something about routing as well. Okay, live coding again. Let's see what we could do. For instance, I told you that there will be controllers, so we could give that thing an ng controller, right? This is also a built-in directive that you could use to annotate something on a class or on an element, that you give that thing a controller, because you don't want to do your logic in your HTML usually, but you have that in a script file. And usually you also don't annotate the ng controller here, you do that with routing and views, but that's something that is more sophisticated and you probably won't use that in the beginning, so that's why I'm not going to show you that. Let's say we have here a controller that we call book controller, right? Because we want to have a list of books. And we do that in a non-responsive way, which is a table, I apologize. And we want to print out a list of books, right? So at some point you will end up with including a script which has your application, but just for a demo purpose, we do a script tag here and include everything that we require in that script tag. It's just that you see. I hope you can see that in the back, because it's quite small. Okay, let's say this book controller should give us a list of books that we want to show on our page. And that would mean at some point we have here a book that we want to display, right? But where does it come from? We know that we have on top here a book controller, so we have to somehow specify this book controller. And that's done with the concept called controller, which is not what I wanted. So, but first we have to talk about a module quick. And a module is a concept like in Java, for instance, you would have something like namespaces or packages that you bind some specific classes to one namespace that you don't have collisions and stuff. And we call our module just simple book app. That's our module. We have just one module, and we don't require anything else. What you see here is, if you declare a module, you usually have dependencies, and that's also something Angular handles for you. It is called dependency injection. You should be familiar with that if you're coming from the Java world. And because we do a simple app, we don't have any dependencies so far. Okay? Maybe you can put that a little bit up that you see at the back. Like this. Okay, we have our book app. Again, if we have annotated our application at the top with ng app, that tells Angular this is an application, so please bootstrap that application for me and use whatever is inside that is somehow looking like it is bound to Angular, like all the directives that you see. We have to tell actually Angular also which app it should instantiate. Like in the beginning you have seen an example with no controllers, with no logic that we added, so it worked like this, but it won't work currently since we created a book application, which is a module, and we have to tell Angular which module to instantiate. So at the top we specify this is the module which instantiates the complete application. You could have several modules that later on, if they are combined, generate your complete application. You have a book application that requires, for instance, some backend service, some whatever, and you specify that with dependencies, for instance, at the bottom. Okay, now we have told Angular the book application is our bootstrapped, or our application that should be bootstrapped, And we have told here that we would like to use something that is called a book controller. But there is no book controller so far, so we specify one. In Angular, that's just done like this, and we give it a name. I called it book CTRL, which is okay. And typical for JavaScript, you have something which is an anonymous function. You have that in Java meanwhile as well. You could do that different. You could give it a named function as well, or a named method as well. But for the sake of simplicity, we just do it like this. And what that book controller should do, it should give us the books that are there, right? So that we have a list of books that we want to print out. Something that is quite special to Angular is that they're using a concept which is called scope. A scope is something that you see here at the top, where we have created a controller, right? And this div for this controller actually goes until here. We should do that the other way around. We should stop here with that div that you see where it ends. So this complete div is one scope, which means, I don't know if you see that it is marked. It's okay. This is something which is a scope. In a programming-like way, you have also scope. Yeah, if you create an if statement, you have a scope inside that if statement. And if you leave that if statement again, that scope is gone. And that's the same in Angular. If you create something like with a directive, for instance, this ng controller, it tells you, okay, I create now a scope for this block. And you could have multiple scopes inside, inside one scope there could be another scope and another scope and another scope. And they have a very special behavior, which is in JavaScript prototypal inheritance, which is very weird, and you probably don't want to hear about that. But still, what we have here is a book controller, and Angular creates for us a reference to that scope and injects that scope reference to our controller. This is, again, dependency injection. So that means our book controller is dependent on the scope. And on that scope, I want to create the property, which is books, right? So we have an array of books, and they have, let's say, PHP anti-patterns. Or, I don't know, clean code. Or, what is another nice book?
JavaScript, the good parts.
JavaScript, the good parts. Are you serious?
Very small.
Okay. So now we have created some books on that scope, and then they are bound to that controller, which has that scope. And that scope is instantiated at the top with the ng controller directive, which should mean that afterwards that book should be there. But, well, the thing is, in that table, I now have just one single book. Not one single book, but I have a list of books. So that means we have another directive, which is ng repeat. And the code completion is quite nice because it tells you what it does. It gives you a key and a value in a data set, and that would mean we have a book in our books, right? And what that directive does, this is also built in, it creates that specific tr tag multiple times, again for each book, and that should mean that afterwards, if we refresh the page, we would have a list of books. As you see, we have a list of books. That's quite nice. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to say that. That's quite nice. Is there any questions so far about the directive which repeats something, or the controller itself?
If you now write something in the enter your name part, will it automatically shift the table beneath, or will it write over the table?
You mean this name here?
Yeah.
It would still work, I hope.
Okay.
Because there's an H3 tag just above the table, so you will see that it still works. Okay?
Yeah, Frankie, can we have nested controllers? Like,
Of course.
And if we for some reason have books two times, how can we differentiate them? So, for example, book and books, and then we have nested controller.
Yes.
That also has.
That's a good question. Usually you don't do it like this, that's what I told you already, but you have a construct which is called book controller as, let's say, book CTRL, right? So I have a reference to that specific variable or that specific controller, and now you would here iterate for books in book controller.books. And you could have that nested, so you could have the same controller multiple times inside if you want. Probably you don't want that, but if you want, this should still work. It doesn't, which is okay. But I have a slide prepared which does exactly the same thing. Very nice, right? Good question. I haven't asked him to ask that question. That's a good question. I have here prepared actually the same, a little bit different. We still have at the bottom a book controller, and I use it different. And that's the problem that we have in the other thing. Okay, I use it different. The thing is, if you use a controller as syntax, as you see on top, you cannot inject the scope as you have seen here, because the scope is actually a quite bad construct that was considered nice 2 weeks ago. Now it's bad. Actually, in the Angular world, they are changing, or in the JavaScript world, they're changing concepts quite fast. It's not like in the JVM where they, need years to specify some new behavior. In the JavaScript world, they change everything very, very fast, and that's quite annoying. But the thing is, if you have a look at this here scope, it is tight coupled to the book controller, and the book controller actually doesn't care if there is a scope or not. So the better solution is to not inject anything which the controller doesn't need. What it does is it creates a variable. Well, this is actually, it doesn't require a variable, but this thing that the as syntax at the top means, it creates a new instance of that controller. If you don't use it with the as keyword, it will always use the same controller, a singleton pattern, to be almost a singleton pattern. And in that case, you get a new instantiation of the book controller, which means it returns the reference to that controller, and if you see the function at the bottom, it uses this. And this is the keyword for, this is the instance variable, the reference to the instance of that object. And I just use the bar book controller equals this, because this in JavaScript is considered bad as well. Because it changes the context depending on where you are in your application, or if you change the scope, for instance. And now you see here that you have a book in a book controller.books. And actually I did already something that you haven't seen so far, so let's forget about that one. But we should be able to see it here. So now we have the same functionality. You have a list of books, and now I have other books than we had before, but still. The books are added to a controller with that array at the bottom that you see. And now as a software engineer or architect, you would tell me this is bad because you have books which look like a model, and you have a controller which is a controller, and you have a view which is the HTML part, but you haven't split that stuff, right? So we should split that at some point, and we will do. But still, what I want to show you as well is here at the top, now you have not enter a name, but you have enter a book. And actually I want to type here something like clean for clean code. I want to find that book, because that's a regular use case that you want to search something in a list. And that's what you just saw but didn't. This was the filter here. Like we could iterate over a list of books and use a built-in filter. Angular has a couple of them, like a filter for an array or a list on a specified property. In that case, the property is name, because my books is now not just a list of strings, but a list of objects, which have a title and an author and a price. No name, so let's call it title, right? You have a look at that, it's nice. At least you haven't fallen asleep so far. And if I refresh now, we should be able to type here and filter, but it doesn't work. Why? Because something is wrong, obviously. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's wrong, Cindy, actually. It is name. If you have a look at the top, we have an NG model name, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that name does, this is actually the property that we want to filter with. There is, for the filter method, there is another property or another argument that you could specify to filter on which property in the objects that you want to filter. But you have to specify what is my argument that to filter with, and that's the name actually, because we have on top here. You see the name is in that input box, right? So if we type clean, no filters.
So
Makes sense?
No margin, then it still filters.
Yes, it filters on the complete object.
Okay.
Yes. We could specify here, if I'm not wrong, with another colon, let's say author. And if we type something like S, it should only go for authors. Well, you have S in do we have something like Angular wouldn't be found? It will be found. I don't know. This is the beauty of live coding. It never works. Maybe you have to specify that as a string value. I'm not sure. Let's try. Or probably that does nothing. Yeah, it still works. It's nice. That's dynamic typing and dynamic changing everything. It's JavaScript. Cool. Good question. I will look it up and continue later. Another thing is, with that built-in filter, which is called currency. That's also something Angular provides for you. You see at the in the list on that side here that we have already this value formatted as currency, right? Although our price, if you have a look here below, is just a regular double value or float value, right? This is pretty nice. I'm sure that you could specify currency with something like euro. And then you should get, yes, you get euros. That's nice, right? So you could do that based on the user as well. And there's a couple of built-in filters, like for date, that you could format the date. There is something for, I don't know, for almost everything they have a couple of built-in filters.
What is the default value?
Sorry?
What's the default value?
As you have seen, it was $. I'm pretty sure this is the default because my
browser is
it uses the browser's locale probably, and probably I'm not sure, and that would be English in that case. So the default should be English. Okay, but to come back, as I said before, you have now a controller which has the model bound to. That's something you don't want to have. Typically, you want to have something injected into your model. Like in Java, you would create something like, oh, I want to have a book service that I will get, and the book service should actually return me these books, right? So let's do book service, sorry, I cannot type. Get all, which gives me the books. Now we don't have a book service. And just for the sake of simplicity, I do it in the same file. Usually you have your service in your own JavaScript file, your controller in your own JavaScript file, and we come to that later. I have an example which does exactly that. But we have to speak about services a little. I still hope you can see that in the back. Let's put it up. And we call that service book service, right? Which is also just a plain function. And that plain function, because it is a service, has also, okay, we have to talk about that keyword first. In Angular, there are a couple of concepts that do the same thing. The one is called service, the one is called provider, and the other is factory. And the thing is, they do basically the same thing. They create for you a service, or something that you could use like a service. If you call that here factory, it does the same, but it has to return something. That's the same in Java. If you have a factory, you get an instance of a specification of that service, right? So we could here say service or factory, but if we go for service, that would mean it creates an instance of that service once, and everything is bound to this. So you would have to have this get all, which is the function that we want to create that return all that books that we now have here. Right? Makes sense? Or we could change that, because I don't like this, because this is kind of weird in JavaScript. So although it's called service, I call that factory. And what it does mean, we have to return an instance of something, which returns our service that we now are going to create. And let's call this service, this is just a plain object, and what we do now is we say service has a function that is called getAll. Is that something you would do in Java as well? Creating a service which returns you your models, or yes? No? Yes. You have a repository, for instance. You could also call it book repository, which gives you the list of these books. Well, and if we refresh that, we should still have the list of books, which is nice, and we should still be able to sort them. And just to make sure I'm not cheating, removing some books and refresh it, and you see they're gone. And well, now you could tell, is there a question? No.
No.
Now you can tell that in the JavaScript world you usually have your data not in your JavaScript file, but you get them from a server. And you do a REST call or an AJAX call which gives you that data. And to be honest, let's do that. If that is still interesting. Now we go for another dependency injection in our service, which means our service uses a built-in dependency which is called $HTTP. What that means is, or every variable that you inject into Angular which has the prefix of $, is something Angular provides by itself. As you have seen at the bottom, the book service does not have that $sign in front, which means that is something we created ourselves or was provided by a third-party library. But $HTTP is something that is included, and you could, if you come from the Jquery world, compare it to $.getJSON, if you have seen that in Jquery.
That's just a convention like the ng prefix for...
This is a convention, yes.
Yeah.
There is another convention, there is also something like $, which means that's an internal method that you shouldn't call. Like, that's the marking of, that's private. And for, I mean, you could do something like public and private in JavaScript quite easily, but for the sake of performance, they have something which they can call internally without that construct. So they have $. Like, that's a specific question we could discuss later. They have weird stuff going on there. And what that would mean is, okay, we don't return from that service the books that we have created here, but we use that from our web server somehow. So what we do is we go for just get, and I have prepared an API endpoint which should give us books. This won't work. Why?
It's not host.
No.
Server's not running.
No. I hope it is. The thing is with the JavaScript and AJAX, what does the A mean in AJAX?
Asynchronous.
Asynchronous, exactly. And what we return here is a promise, or something that is asynchronous. So what we get here is a promise that's asynchronous, which means we cannot just say the books is now that promise, right? Which doesn't make sense. So in our controller, and that's also something you wouldn't do in your controller, you would inject, in general, the already fetched books from somewhere else. But just for the sake of simplicity, in the book controller, we call that method, and because that's a promise, we have a then function on that promise, which means invoke the function I specify here after that promise was resolved. So that's the callback hell in JavaScript, as you know. And what we now do is we specify that the books that we have in our list or in our controller should be that what we get here. This is the response that we got from the server, and the response has a property which is called data. This is just because we are using HTTP. And if we are doing it now, we see that we have a list of books that come from a server. And if you don't believe me, which you shouldn't, and I refresh the page, you see that we are doing an AJAX request here. You probably don't see that. But here at the top there is a the AJAX request, which is a get, and you see here in the preview it gives me a list of books.
Is this JavaScript pure? Is this a Zen function?
It will be JavaScript in about half a year. It is called the Promise, and it's a concept which is coming from a third-party library. But it will be a standard in ECMAScript 6, which will arrive next year, hopefully.
So currently it's only Angular.
No, it's not Angular specific. It's a library called Q, and Q gives you that functionality. And that library is well established and well known. Even Jquery has tried to adapt it or use it. And this syntax is quite nice because what happens if this service is not available? Like if I have here books, right? This is an API call that would probably respond something like 404, hopefully. If I refresh the page, nothing happens, and if you have a look at the calls, you see that there is a 404 here at the bottom, right? And this then functionality has a second callback. Yeah, I cannot type. A second callback which gives me the rejection. And what we could do here is we could console log. There was an error. This is also something you wouldn't do in your controller. You have a handler for your errors somewhere else usually. But just for the sake of simplicity again, you see that you get here an error at the bottom. Okay, I have a token somewhere, we shouldn't know this one. So if there is a 404, you see there was an error here at the bottom, which is our error handler that we specified. So that promise syntax is quite nice because it has it resolves something that you had previously in JavaScript. You created an AJAX call, and you had to wait on the result, and with that result you had to do another AJAX call, right? Because you had like, okay, first I want to get the user. If I have the user, I want to get his cars, and if I have his cars, I want to get, I don't know. And that means you have a callback, callback, callback. That means you have a long list going somewhere that you cannot manage anymore. And with that promise library, you have something like resolve all, which means do that, and after that do that, and then do that, and if you're done with that, call me back. Which means you have just one callback afterwards. And that's quite, I like that, that's kind of nice. But it's not specifically Angular, this is something that is there from other vendors. Okay, so if we go back to the books thing. Okay, now that we have a lot of them, and they're coming from a server, we might want to sort them, not just filter them, but we want to order them as well. That's why in our ng repeat, there is another built-in that we could use, and that's order by. And here we have to specify what is the property that we want to order by. And in that case, I'm not sure because Cindy confused me. Let's use the price, and then we see, yeah, it's ordered by the price. That's pretty nice because you could specify here also another ng model that you have somewhere in your code, and on top have a button to change the sorting, which is something that was quite painful to do that earlier with Wicked, for instance, where you have to do another server request and render it again, and quite weird. This is pretty nice and built in.
If you would sort reverse, I mean, from the highest price?
Yes, then nice question. Do a minus in front and it's sorted the other way around. Pretty straightforward, right?
What if you leave the quote marks out?
Well, this is a string, so you have to pass in a string because it uses that string to resolve on your object.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask why.
Because else, yeah, well, that's the same if in a programming language. If you use just a string without telling this is now a string, it will not
I do
compile.
get the string part. The weird thing is that the minus is part of the string.
Convention? I don't know.
How can you set it dynamic?
Well, we could have here, because then you wouldn't use the quotes, right? The quotes are stupid. Then you go sort of like, okay, use the order, and you have on top here, you have something like let's create a button, change order, and we give it an ng model. Well, it is weird to do that with an ng model. Let's say if we click that, we say the order equals to not the order. So just flip it. Just weird. This won't work. Yeah, well, you have to specify actually that the order is, in that case, if use price, then you have a button which use the order is price, right? And if you do the same thing with title, and then you go here for use title, then it should work. Use price, it orders by price. Use title, orders by title. Pretty simple. And I haven't planned that. It worked, yes! That's nice. Okay, but still, we don't have that much time left, so I'm gonna show you how you would. This is the advanced part that we have already seen. And yes, let's go to the part where this is how it should look in the end and how you would do it. The complete HTML is gone. You just have one simple tag, which is the UI view tag, which tells Angular, okay, here render my view. What I have hidden here, and this is cheating, this is the header, which includes all the JavaScript part that you have there. But this is something that we have to talk about, because in the end, you will end up with one single JavaScript file, which is minified, and you don't have all of them here. This is just during development, usually. You have tools that does that for you. But what you see at the top, we have some style sheets, forget about that. And then we have dependencies. One is Angular, of course, and the other part is some libraries that we use with Angular. And then it starts with your application, which includes the bootstrapping part of your application, which is in Java would be the main class, or the class that has your main method. And afterwards, you include the book module. This is something like, I think Ulf asked me that question already. How can we, scale the Angular application? Because that what we just saw looks a little bit, still ugly and still jQuery-like. You cannot maintain that anymore. But let's have a look at what would be in an app.js. This is the app.js, so you don't have anything. It tells the app.js on top, the bootstrap. My app is still called book app. It has a dependency on the UI router, which is a third-party library which does that UI view that you just saw. And if you can read that here, you see on top that you have here books, right? So the UI view is specified with an URL. If you create a single-page application, sometimes your product owner will complain, oh, we cannot index that with Google, and Google doesn't see that. Why would you do it with JavaScript? Because it's not static HTML that is produced, but it is rendered with JavaScript. Well, this is a little nice thing that you have here on top, a routing mechanism. So if I click on that book, I get to that specific book. I have another view, and it is specific, or you see it here in the URL at the end. There is a /1, right? Which is, I think, quite nice. But to come back to the application, you see the application itself does not much. It tells, okay, I have an URL provider, which is also something from Angular or UI route that you can forget about. It's just the default view that you should see. And then it includes the book module. And if we have a look at the, the book system, yeah, I know. I'm not sure if you can make the side menu bigger. But you probably see that I have now a module folder, and there is a book module. And the book module has, again, an index file. And that index in the book module, we can make that bigger. We don't need the red. Go away. The book module itself is also quite simple, but it tells I am the book module, and I have another dependency, which is REST Angular, which is a tool to do REST calls, which is nicer than the $HTTP. It's a wrapper around it. Anyway. And you just do something. My module has to be configured in the beginning. That means I have a config block for that module. And it tells the REST Angular provider, okay, my base URL is /API. So all the calls to the REST endpoints go to /API. And the REST service, or the book service itself doesn't have to specify this is /API/version 1 or something. You could do that here. And you cannot read that from the back, but you have it in a quite nice structure. So the book module has a controller folder, it has a model folder and a templates folder. So let's have it I called it model, but actually it's the books service that we created. And what it does, it has nothing more than, it uses REST Angular. It tells the endpoint is /books, although it doesn't know about /API, which is configured from the outside. And it has that method find one. And I also did it in a slightly different way than previously, because in JavaScript it's quite bad to do something in a global scope. That's why you have that immediate invoked function expression that you see on top. It's wrapped around that statement. It's also quite bad to have unnamed functions. That means my factory books uses a named function which is called books, that is defined here at the top, and that is returned. And if you have a look at the book list controller, which is also quite small, what it does, it creates the book list controller which gets injected already the books, but not the book service, because the controller doesn't care usually about the service which provides you that information. And the book list controller gets a resolve block, which is something that UI router does for you, or ng-route does for you. It prefetches some data, or it does something before the controller is instantiated. And in that case, the resolve function has a books, which means the books that I inject into my controller are prefetched with that function here. And that function is, okay, use the book service, which I call books here, I don't know why. And it gets all the books, and after that, after the promise is returned or resolved, the books controller is instantiated with that books. So the controller is 2 lines of code, meanwhile, or 3 if you count columns and stuff. What it does additionally is the configuration for that specific route, and that's something I told you in the beginning. If we have time, we have a look at the routes quickly. At the top you have seen previously there was /books and then /books/1, and that's something that we have to configure at some point. So we inject a state provider, which means each application route is also some state. Yeah? Like the books list is a state and the books detail is a state, and you can switch between them with URLs. And that means the state provider for books, if the URL is /books, then use this controller, use the controller as syntax, as we have seen previously, that was your question. And use that template, because you don't want to put the HTML also, everything in the index HTML. So I'm going to show you quick the list template, which is quite nice, and the most part you see here is because of Bootstrap, yeah, like all the classes and stuff. But here again, you have the same syntax as you've seen before. It uses the book in the book list controller .books, and it has a filter on search, and it has it has now a URL to that specific book, which is done here with the state wrap, but that's not so interesting. It has a picture and all the other properties. That's the same stuff that you saw in the beginning, but just in a nicer and cleaner way, that you could structure your application in small single modules that can be reused and added to another application if you want. Okay, time is almost up. We have done something about routing. What I want to tell you is what we have learned. It's quite difficult to do a live coding and give you the complete impression about AngularJS. But still, you should have seen that it is quite simple to use, even if you're not familiar with JavaScript in general. And it's, in my opinion, but I'm biased, the best approach to build a single page application. You cannot do that with, you can with Jquery, but it's kind of a pain in the ass if you try to do that. We have seen the key features, we have seen directives, filters, two-way data binding, like the ng model part, which is in the expression again put out. We have seen views, controllers, and the bad scope thing. And now in the end we saw a little bit about routes. These are things that are usually asked. Why is it Angular and why is it not something else? Because that's the rules about Angular. What we haven't talked about is testing, and they're quite good at testing. since you have your models quite small, you could test each controller, each service, each directive specifically with a very nice testing framework. They do decouple the client side and the backend side, so you have you don't have a rendering engine on your server which does actually code for the client. It's kind of weird. They decouple that. The rest is not so interesting. And then there was a question yesterday about, just quick, this one. Yes, there is Angular 2.0, and yes, it is kind of, well, the community is not sure if it is good or not. What I can tell you is, it is not ready. It is pre-concept something alpha. It is not even something that you should consider doing. You shouldn't wait to use it, because if you wait, it might still use 1 or 1.5 years until it's ready. And yes, your code that you write now with 1 dot something will be maybe obsolete with 2.0. But the good part is like the same thing with Ubuntu LTS. Angular 1.3 will be supported with at least fixes for the next 2 or 3 years, so you don't have to worry about that. You might not get all the newest features, but some of them are already now backported from 2.0 pre-alpha to 1.3. So you might get all the cool features in 1.3, maybe not. And the last sentence is maybe not true in every project at the client base, but it will get more true in the next coming years, since your application will, well, it will get at some point replaced by something new. And that is maybe in 3 years. So if you start now, in 3 years your application or project is anyway dead. However, still, they have done in Angular 2.0 some things that are nice, and I want to point out what they have done. The problem currently is JavaScript is ECMAScript 5, and that's obsolete in 1 year. It will be ECMAScript 6. So they try to get all the features from ECMAScript 6 into Angular 2.0, and that's why they don't use directives, they don't use controllers, they don't use that service construct that we have seen. But in the end, it will be quite simple to merge an application with a decoupled service that you just saw, which just gets a dependency injected, however that dependency looks, and uses it. So you can use your existing controllers and or your existing services if you structure them nicely. And the rest is like, well, I don't like Dart. I have to admit this is not my favorite language. And what they do with Angular 2.0 is they build something on top of JavaScript, on top of TypeScript, on top of, or on top they call it AdScript. That's how they build it, and that transpiles to either JavaScript or Dart. Which means you could later use Angular Dart with the same core that you have in AngularJS. That's the thing. But, well, I don't like Dart because they have a complete different meaning about DOM. They have a complete different... Anyway, that's neat. Okay, I hope you had some insights, and if you have a question,
yes,
quick.
Will ECMAScript 6 have any impact on Angular 1?
No. No. Everything that runs with ECMAScript 5 will run with ECMAScript 6. Even
ECMAScript 6 has some features or some things that...
But they're on top.
Yeah, okay.
They're additional, like class, for instance. You don't have to use it. And yeah, class
yeah,
nice.
Exactly, yeah, because this maybe could have some impact on Angular.
No, everything that works with JavaScript now will run with ECMAScript 6. It will also run with TypeScript. It will also run with AdScript. You don't have to use the concept. They're just on top. Which means you don't have to use generics in Java. They're there if you want to use them. And your compiler will complain about if you don't use them. But you don't have to. So your code will still work, and it will not even throw any warning, because it's valid JavaScript code.
But Angular won't change anything from to optimize for it.
No. They even want to run Angular 2.0 with ECMAScript 5, which will work, definitely. This will work, because they use just AdScript to create Angular 2.0. AdScript will transpile, they call it transpile, to something that is either Dart or JavaScript. But it will run with ECMAScript 5, so your IE7 support will be there. Perfect. That's what we all wanted. Like, now let's have lunch, because that's the best part, right?